when you, walk through the automatic doors of a modern hospital, your brain instantly processes this very specific kind of security.
Oh, yeah, completely.
You know what I mean? Like you smell that sanitized air, you see the pristine floors, the bright lighting.
The shadowless lights everywhere.
Exactly. And you subconsciously just assume that the entire environment is, well, as rigorously controlled as a surgical theater.
Right. You trust the system.
You trust that the people in the white coats are governed by this ironclad set of rules designed to protect you. But, and here's the question for today's deep dive, what happens when the most severe threat to patient and staff safety isn't, I don't know, a multi-drug resistant bacteria?
Or some complex surgical complication.
Right. What if the biggest threat is actually the administration's inability to manage the very people wearing those white coats?
Which is a terrifying thought, honestly. I mean, it shatters that entire illusion of the impenetrable sanctuary.
Really does.
We rely so heavily on that projection of institutional competence. But the reality is that a hospital's true safety net isn't made of sterilization equipment. It's made of extremely difficult, often invisible personnel decisions.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. Today, we are opening up a brief but incredibly dense manifesto-style document.
A very intense document.
Yeah. It's titled, Why Non-Renewal is Not a Choice Hyphen. It's the Only Responsible Path.
Just a striking title right out of the gate.
Totally. So for you, the listener, the goal here is to really decode these high-stakes, behind-the-scenes realities of healthcare leadership when severe misconduct occurs.
Because it does happen more than we like to think.
Right. We're going to explore why simply, firing someone isn't the whole story here, how institutional architecture handles toxicity, and how leadership in medicine is truly defined.
It's going to be a lot.
It is. Okay, let's unpack this, because the source opens with a thesis that, it completely dismantles the traditional hospital hierarchy.
It does. It really takes a hammer to it.
It explicitly states that in healthcare, leadership isn't a title you wear. It's defined by trust, safety, and accountability.
Yeah, and that opening line alone, it fundamentally rewrites how we usually think about medical authority,
How so?
Well, in the day-to-day operations of a hospital, titles carry, immense weight. You have the chief of surgery, the head of radiology, the senior attending physician.
And people who kind of run the show.
Exactly. These are individuals who often bring in millions of dollars in grant money, or they possess rare, highly sought-after clinical skills.
The rainmakers.
Right, the rainmakers. But this text argues that the moment a crisis of behavior occurs, those prestigious titles lose all their currency.
Wow, all of it.
All of it. If they aren't actively backed by the maintenance of a safe environment, the title means nothing.
And the document doesn't shy away from what that crisis of behavior actually looks like either. It lists out the specific severe types of substantiated concerns that force this issue to the surface.
The really dark stuff.
Yeah. It mentions workplace bullying, gender inequity, and sexual misconduct.
Yeah, it's very blunt about it.
And the author makes a crucial pivot right here, which I think is fascinating. The text insists that when these acts occur, it is no longer a personal failing. It immediately transforms into an institutional risk.
Yes, that's a huge distinction.
Let's look at the mechanics of how that transformation happens. I kind of think about this like a massive container ship, right, traversing the ocean.
Okay, I like this.
So if you have a highly skilled surgeon who habitually bullies the nursing staff, it might appear to, a casual observer as a localized personal problem.
Just a bad interaction in one room.
Exactly. Just one bad apple on a giant ship.
Oh.
But as this text argues, it's actually a structural crack below the waterline.
Oh, wow.
Right. And the pressure of the ocean is going to force water through that localized crack until the entire vessel's hull is compromised. It sinks the whole ship.
What's fascinating here is how the source material crystallizes that dynamic. It literally states, this is not about individuals. This is about standards. Standards.
Right.
Yeah. To understand why a localized problem threatens the whole ship, we really have to look at the psychology of high-stress workplaces.
Okay. Break that down for us.
Well, a baseline standard in any institution isn't what the human resources department prints in the employee handbook.
Right. Nobody reads that anyway.
Exactly. The true standard is the absolute lowest level of behavior that leadership is willing to tolerate.
Oh, wow. Wait. So by tolerating the brilliant but abusive doctor, you are essentially establishing a new lower floor for everyone else.
Yes. The baseline drops for the entire ecosystem.
That makes so much sense.
If an institution looks the other way when a prominent physician engages in, say, sexual misconduct or blatant gender inequity, the psychological safety of the entire system degrades.
And in a hospital, psychological safety isn't just like a soft HR buzzword.
No, not at all. In medicine, it is literally a life or death clinical metric.
Because if people are scared,
Exactly. When nurses are demeaned by a senior doctor, they eventually just stop speaking up. They might notice a medication error, right, or a break in sterile protocol.
but they don't say anything.
Because the fear of being berated outweighs their willingness to intervene. The toxicity starts with one individual, infects the communication of the team, and eventually the ultimate cost is paid by the patient.
Man. So the institutional risk isn't just about, like, bad PR, getting sued. It's about the fundamental collapse of clinical safety,
Precisely, it compromises the core mission of the hospital.
which really explains why the text outlines a very specific trajectory for how these crises, inevitably spiral outward.
Yeah, they never just stay in one department.
Right. When a problem metastasizes from an individual failing into a systemic threat, it follows this predictable escalation. The author maps this out into 3 developments.
Yeah, let's walk through those.
Okay, so it starts with internal investigations that lead to formal findings and administrative actions.
And that initial internal phase is so critical because we aren't talking about rumors here. We are dealing with substantiated concerns.
Right. They have proof.
Exactly. The institution has done the interviews, they've reviewed the documentation, and they've confirmed that the misconduct is real.
Okay, but then the text points to a secondary escalation. This is where it says the case moves to disciplinary review within a national professional society.
Yes.
And then finally, the third step, the concerns extend to organizational governance and public trust.
That's the full spiral.
Okay, wait. I have to push back a bit on this progression.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
If the hospital has already conducted a thorough internal investigation, right, and they've arrived at formal findings of misconduct, why does the text highlight a national professional society getting involved?
Ah, that's a great question.
Doesn't the local hospital administration have the ultimate authority to just, handle their own personnel issues in-house? Like, why bring in the national folks?
Well, they do hold authority over their specific facility, but this brings us to the unique architecture of medical credentialing.
Okay.
And the text actually hints at this heavily. If we look at the metadata for this source, it includes tags for #radiology and #medical ethics.
Oh, I saw those tags, yeah.
Right. Those tags are doing a lot of structural work here. In medicine, a doctor's career isn't just tied to their employer.
Right, it's bigger than just one hospital.
Yeah, they operate within this complex web of state medical boards, specialty board certifications, and national professional societies.
So their professional identity exists both locally and nationally.
Precisely. And the text illustrates a massive ethical hazard here.
What's the hazard?
Well, if a local hospital discovers severe sexual misconduct, there is often a powerful administrative temptation to just, handle it quietly.
Just sweep it under the rug.
Yeah, they might just ask the doctor to resign, avoiding a messy public firing or a lawsuit.
Right, NDAs, a quiet exit.
But if they handle it purely in-house without escalating it to the national level, that doctor retains their pristine national board certification.
Oh, no.
And then they simply move to another hospital one state over.
It's the pass the trash phenomenon.
Exactly, the classic pass the trash.
You solve your own local headache by basically inflicting a known predator on an unsuspecting community somewhere else. That's wild.
And that is where the #medical ethics tag becomes so central. By acknowledging that these issues have to escalate to a national professional society, the institution is forced out of its local silo.
It triggers field-wide scrutiny.
Yes. The author is showing us that failing to manage a toxic individual isn't just a failure of one hospital. It breaches the walls of the institution, implicating broader organizational governance.
I'm threatening the public's trust in the entire medical profession.
Exactly.
The stakes are just astronomical when you frame it that way. I mean, it isn't just about maintaining harmony in one department. It is about defending the credibility of the entire field.
Which brings us directly to the core argument of this whole manifesto.
Right. When faced with this level of systemic threat, the author argues that the only responsible path for leadership is, quote, non-renewal of appointment.
Yes. And let's define what that actually means mechanically.
Please do.
Because it is distinct from just, firing someone on a random Tuesday.
Right. It's a specific process.
Yeah. In the medical field, physicians are typically granted clinical privileges and academic or administrative appointments for set, finite periods.
Like a contract.
Kind of, often a year or two at a time. The administration must actively review and renew those privileges for the doctor to continue practicing at that facility.
Okay, so they have to say yes again every couple of years.
Exactly. So non-renewal is the administrative mechanism of saying, we have reviewed your tenure, and based on severe violations of our standards, we are affirmatively choosing not to extend your privileges.
They just don't sign the paper. The text introduces a massive paradigm shift in how we're supposed to view this action, though, because it contains what I think is the most striking phrase in the entire document.
I know exactly which line you're talking about.
It says, in such circumstances, non-renewal of appointment is not punitive, it is protective.
That completely upends the traditional narrative of workplace discipline.
Totally.
Yeah.
Because we are socially conditioned to view losing a job as a punishment for bad behavior.
Right. You did something bad, so you get punished by getting fired.
But here's where it gets really interesting for me. Because reframing it as protective changes the entire emotional weight of the decision.
How do you mean?
Well, think about it like amputating an infected limb.
Ah, that's a visceral analogy.
Right. But think about it. When a surgeon removes a leg that has severe gangrene, they aren't doing it to punish the leg.
Right. They aren't mad at the leg.
Exactly. They aren't seeking vengeance against the limb. They are taking a severe, destructive action solely to protect the rest of the body from total failure. They do it to save the life of the patient.
That is exactly what the author is getting at.
In this context, refusing to renew a toxic leader's contract isn't an act of vengeance against that individual. It is the amputation. You are doing it to save the integrity of the hospital team.
The amputation analogy perfectly captures the proactive nature of the text's argument, and the author actually constructs this philosophy on 4 distinct foundations.
The 4 pillars.
Yes, explaining exactly how this action serves a protective function. The first of these is the immediate protection of staff safety.
With a specific emphasis on vulnerable groups, right?
Exactly. And in a medical setting, vulnerable groups isn't some abstract concept.
No, it's very real. It refers directly to the stark power dynamics we discussed earlier.
You have medical students, junior residents, nursing staff.
Even administrative workers.
Right, people whose entire careers can be derailed by a single senior physician. Protecting them from workplace bullying and harassment is the most literal interpretation of institutional defense.
It's step 1. What's the second foundation?
Building on that, the text points to the preservation of clinical integrity and team cohesion.
Like we were talking about with psychological safety.
Yes. Modern medicine is inherently a team sport. A complex surgery might require the synchronized efforts of a dozen different professionals.
It's like a ballet.
Right. And if cohesion fractures because, say, a scrub tech is terrified of the lead surgeon, the clinical integrity of the procedure just vanishes. Non-renewal protects the communication networks that literally keep patients alive.
Wow. Which naturally leads into the third pillar, the legal and ethical reality of the situation, which the source also highlights.
Oh, absolutely. The legal exposure is massive.
Because if a hospital knows they have a physician with substantiated findings of gender inequity or misconduct, they choose to renew that contract anyway.
They're no longer just tolerating the behavior.
Right, they're endorsing it.
They become legally and morally complicit. Refusing to renew the appointment protects the institution from that complicity. It upholds their credibility and ensures they remain compliant with the law.
And ethical guidelines, too.
Precisely.
And the final piece of the author's argument, the fourth pillar, is perhaps the most forceful. It's about sending an undeniable message. Zero tolerance is not a slogan. It must be action.
Action is everything.
You can plaster the break room walls with all the posters you want about maintaining a respectful workplace,
The glossy HR posters.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if leadership just rubber stamps the contract renewal of someone who has repeatedly violated those rules, those posters become worse than meaningless.
They do. They become a monument to institutional hypocrisy.
That's exactly it.
It forces leadership to align their actions with their stated values. And that brings us to the author's stark warning about what happens when leadership blinks in these moments.
Right, when they hesitate.
The text boils the entire sprawling complexity of healthcare administration down to one fundamental principle.
Patients and professionals must be safe.
It is a completely uncompromising baseline.
And because that principle is absolute, the warning that follows it is severe. I'm just going to read it directly. The author writes, Any hesitation in acting decisively risks normalizing behavior that should never be normalized.
That word normalizing is key.
Yeah, I really want to spend some time on that concept of normalization because it is so incredibly insidious. How does the mere act of hesitating, like just pausing to figure out what to do with a prominent, high-earning doctor, how does that actually normalize deviant behavior?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, specifically to a sociological concept known as the normalization of deviance.
Okay, I've heard that phrase.
Yeah. We see that human beings are remarkably adaptable, for better or worse. We are constantly scanning our environment to figure out the actual rules of the game.
Right, regardless of what the rule book actually says.
Exactly. So when an authority figure consistently crosses a line, say, engaging in blatant bullying during clinical rounds, and the administration hesitates.
Because that doctor is like a local celebrity.
Yeah. Or brings in massive research funding, right? When they hesitate, the rest of the staff registers that hesitation.
The silence becomes the new policy.
Yes, the staff internalizes a very clear message. This toxic behavior is actually acceptable, provided you are important enough to the bottom line.
Ugh, that's so dark.
The abnormal action slowly becomes the daily routine. People stop complaining because they see that complaints yield zero results.
They just adapt to the toxicity to survive their shifts.
Right. And once a culture normalizes deviance, it embeds itself deep into the institutional DNA. It takes immense effort and often sweeping personnel changes over many years to root it out once it sets in.
Which is why the text insists that the hesitation itself is a risk.
Yes. Delaying the decision is functionally making a decision to accept the behavior.
It's like the bystander effect elevated to an institutional level.
Yeah.
The hospital administration itself becomes a passive bystander to
Or
abuse.
watching the infection spread.
Right. Watching the infection spread while debating whether they can afford the cost of the amputation.
And this brings the entire document full circle to its concluding thesis on the true nature of leadership.
Which is?
The text declares, leadership is tested not when things go well, but when difficult decisions must be made. This is one of those moments.
I mean, it is so easy to be the CEO or the chief medical officer when the hospital is winning safety awards.
Or expanding its facilities.
Right, operating at a massive surplus. Everything is great.
But true leadership, according to this framework, isn't about managing success.
What is it about?
It is about the willingness to look at a highly profitable, highly skilled, but deeply toxic individual and possessing the moral courage to say, your behavior threatens the structural integrity of this institution.
You are the infected limb.
Exactly. For the protection of our staff, our patients, and our profession, we are not renewing your appointment. It requires leaders to prioritize long-term safety over short-term convenience.
For financial gain.
Right.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener?
Good question.
Even if your daily life never intersects with the administrative wing of a hospital, you inevitably rely on the architecture of these systems.
We all do.
When you, or someone you love, are wheeled into an emergency room or a radiology department in a moment of extreme vulnerability, your physical safety relies entirely on the invisible, agonizing decisions made by administrators months or even years prior.
That's a sobering thought.
It is.
Yeah.
Your safety depends on leaders who understood the concept of the amputation leaders who actively refuse to renew bad contracts. It depends on institutions prioritizing protective action over punitive hesitation.
Ensuring the people treating you are held to an uncompromising standard.
Exactly.
It really highlights a universal truth about the structures we rely on. A safe society is built on a foundation of incredibly difficult decisions.
Yeah.
The integrity of any vital institution, whether it's a hospital, a university, or, a multinational corporation, is only ever as strong as the worst behavior its leaders are willing to tolerate.
It fundamentally changes how we perceive the presence of conflict within an organization.
It really does.
Which leaves you with a final, slightly provocative thought to carry with you. We've just spent this time unpacking how true leadership is only forged and tested when making these incredibly fraught, highly controversial decisions, like non-renewal.
The really hard calls.
Right. So what does it actually say about an institution that proudly boasts it has never had a scandal?
Never had a high-profile firing.
Exactly. Never had to non-renew anyone's contract. Does a pristine, controversy-free record mean an absence of problems?
Or does it simply mean a complete absence of leadership?
Something to think about the next time you assume a pristine white coat means everything is under control. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.